If you asked somebody who disappeared on November 8th, 2016, what was the one thing Donald Trump wanted to do in his campaign? It was build the wall and make Mexico pay for it. And one, clearly Mexico's not paying for it. Two, he's not going to build a wall or a fence or steel slats or whatever you want to say from sea to shining sea. It's a clear failure in leadership that he couldn't get a legislative package done when Republicans had clear, had majorities.
Could I stop you?
Please.
Just right there. Let's begin with that premise. A clear failure on his part. Let's be totally honest. And since I served with now departed Speaker Paul Ryan on the Ways and Means Committee, let me tell you that Speaker Ryan and others willing to sidetrack the border security agenda worked overtime to get that done. But you're right, the president is the executive, and we learn in civics that the president proposes, the Congress disposes. Sadly, it was far too literal in this point because Mr. Ryan's notion of disposing was to literally put it in legislative file 13. So this is not solely on the head of President Trump. However, what we have just seen, the emergency declaration, and no, it is not a bridge too far. That is a rhetorical tranquilizer used by the open border crowd. Let's just pull back the curtain. Let's talk.
You don't think it's an overreach of executive powers?
It's not an overreach of executive powers. Statutorily, when I was graduating from high school, the Congress of the United States gave the chief executive emergency powers. That has been exercised now. I believe this is either the 56th or the 58th time. But because this is something that is so contrary, not to the interest of America, but contrary to business interests and those on K Street. And if you want me to name names, I will. But I will tell you that as we have seen certain benefactors of the Republican establishment move away and say their sole criterion for supporting candidates now is not some fealty to the Constitution, not some conservative philosophy, but simply being open borders. Now we have seen a change. And so that is why we got the bait and switch over the last 10 days in Congress.
You think conservatives want open borders?
Pardon me?
You think some conservatives want open borders or Republicans?
Conservative guys who claim to be conservative Republicans, absolutely. Absolutely, because they want to mollify business leaders who want cheap labor. Let's just boil the issue down. What should be first and foremost about national security and a sober, urgent solving of a problem, rather than solving this national security problem, what we have seen people in Washington do is treat this as a political problem to be managed, not a national security threat with which to be dealt. And so that's why last week you had a spending bill, massive spending, eclipsing anything we saw out of Mr. Obama or former President George W. Bush. And you saw contained in the legislation, articulated there in statute, limits to what could be done. For example, the notion that 55 miles there on the Rio Grande in Texas, that local officials, some of the law enforcement agencies where it is feared they have connections with the Mexican cartels, will have veto power over what is a fundamental duty of the federal government to enforce borders is absurd. That's the echo that we heard of that grand compromise with the so-called Gang of Eight. I believe the only two Republicans remaining from that are Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham. But remember, they were going to consult the border governors. And with open border governors that were out there, like Janet Napolitano or Arnold Schwarzenegger or Bill Richardson in New Mexico, you were never going to get the kind of federal security on the border you needed. And that is what we have with this. Worse still is language under the guise of keeping families together, which curiously enough, we don't do in our own system of jurisprudence. When someone is convicted, we don't say, oh, gee, we're sorry, we have to separate you from your family. we send people to prison. But somehow now we're going to step away from that when it comes to violating federal law and coming to our country illegally. And worse, the language sets up a situation where children can be trafficked and where children can be used not as human shields, but as human tickets to come into the United States and bring people here unlawfully. So sadly, my criticism, and I offer this in sorrow rather than anger, is that we have taken a situation and rather than improved it. And this is interesting because I hear from so many conservatives who are anti-Trump, he ought to be more collaborative. Well, he was collaborative on this, and Lindsey Graham and the guys gave him the green weenie on this. But of course, it'll be greenbacks into their campaign from the open border interest. And that, of course, is what Senator Graham is concerned about, since he's up for re-election this year.
So clearly the issue today, while H-1B visas and the George W. Bush implementation that was at 04, 05, whatever that was, was a lot about foreign workers and he was hit over open borders back then. But I think the main concern that we're seeing on the border today is that the majority of the people that are coming in, whether you want to call them caravans or migrants or illegals or aliens or whatever you want to say, what the humans that are coming from Guatemala, El Salvador, etc., they are coming to seek asylum. Do they not have the right to come to the border and request asylum?
Let's talk about asylum, since we're playing fast and loose with legal terms, and I could not help but note that you chose to take the language that many on the left use as if entry into this country is a, quote, human right, because after all, these are, quote...
Would you argue that an asylum application is not a human right?
Would you let me finish?
Sure.
This is my point. If you're going to apply for asylum, why would you apply, let's say, for example, if you're from Honduras and you're concerned about unrest within the borders of Honduras, why would you not apply for asylum in a country immediately northward where the threat was removed? That makes this false. But hey, don't worry. The Obama crowd and the open borders crowd colluded in the final year of the Obama administration to make sure we redefined what it was to seek asylum, and we redefined what it was to be a refugee. And so now you've expanded this past political conflict, and you have lawyers down on the border there to coach people. But here's the irony of what you're talking about. These human beings, and in the vast majority of cases, they're not families coming north, as we saw from Honduras and other nations. They are young men, many of whom, upon leaving the country, were waving the flags of the countries they were leaving. That scarcely seems like applicants for asylum looking for some sort of relief from the nations from whence they come. No, it looks like they're they're cheering on the nations they are leaving and intent on coming to the United States, and they'll be coached later on seeking asylum or refugee status. Let's just be honest, Patrick. This is a giant scam designed to do two things: supply the left with cheap votes, although it's going to be costly to American taxpayers in terms of dollars and national security, and supply business with cheap labor. That's what this is all about. And it's a crying shame that people are so frightened of disrupting the order of Washington, D.C., that we don't see that for what this is and address the threats accordingly.
Well, you brought up the Democrats want the new voters, and I've written that, I've said that, I agree with you in that sense, and that's why you get such a push from them to make citizenship so easy. I don't understand why our party, where George W. Bush won 44% of Hispanics in 2004, has driven to such an anti-Brown sentiment. But wave a magic wand. Wave a magic wand for me. Fix the immigration system.
You don't have to wave a magic wand. Since you insist on the, quote, Brown discussion, let's talk about people who came to the nation legitimately as refugees. Those who came from the imprisoned island of Cuba under the regime of Castro. You know what was most revealing to me in the 2016 primary, and as an anchor commentator for Newsmax TV, the Saturday before the Florida presidential primary, I hosted a live program from the Versailles Cafe in Little Havana. You know what was amazing? The people of Little Havana were going to vote for Donald Trump. So let's dispel this myth of the monolith.
Well,
If someone
it was wet foot, dry foot.
a Hispanic name, boom, they're instantly for open borders, and they support that Bush open borders notion, or that notion of Project Libre, where somehow they are introduced to conservatism and presto, changeo, they become conservative Republicans. Patrick, you and I know that is so much pablum that is not working.
What's the difference then, in your mind, between leaving a Castro regime in Cuba and making a 90-mile trip on a raft, and making it onto the sand and then being considered able to stay, and someone who made a trip from Guatemala under the threat of death from a cartel, that once they cross, that they shouldn't be allowed in? What's the difference?
Well, let me ask you, first of all, in the formulation of that question, the cartels in Guatemala. Can you tell me about those? Because the cartels I know more about are the cartels in Mexico,
Sure.
The nation from which they must travel, they must traverse into the United States. You see, I believe what happens in this argument is we tend to get away from specifics, or we tend to somehow say, because the influx of Cubans came in the late 1950s or early 1960s, not to mention, of course, an infamous boat lift where Castro emptied his prisons that affected the presidency of Jimmy Carter and the fledgling 2-year term of a young Southern governor by the name of Bill Clinton, because those quote Cuban immigrants, when Castro was emptying his prisons, were placed at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, which was kind of a harbinger of things to come. The question is, what is legitimate? And I have to tell you, Patrick, I believe by and large, those coming from Central America, those coming from Mexico, are not here because they seek political asylum. They are simply coming because they believe that once they get here, they will be allowed to stay. And courtesy of the legislation that has just been passed, despite the emergency order, unfortunately, it looks like their hunch is correct. So if you want to see open borders, if you think that's vital to the growth of America, if you think that's somehow standing up and saying, no, we have an inherent right as a nation to determine who comes into our country. It is not a, quote, human right. If you want to see that and throw out the laws, just stay tuned, because we've gotten a good start. It's been a bipartisan problem, and apparently, given the pushback from Washington and the so-called pro-business conservatives, it's something that's going to continue.